The Georgetown Law Center had structured its annual Advanced Constitutional Advocacy Seminar as intensive examination of what distinguished exceptional legal argumentation from merely competent performance, with particular focus on identifying moments when advocates' mastery of sources, precision in analytical reasoning, and strategic deployment of evidence had achieved the kind of impact that shaped legal discourse beyond immediate advocacy contexts, and that exemplified skills every legal professional needed to master, regardless of practice setting. Professor Martin Lederman, who taught the seminar and whose own career spanning Supreme Court litigation, Office of Legal Counsel service, and constitutional law scholarship, had given him unique perspective on evaluating advocacy effectiveness across diverse contexts, had begun the semester's first class by explaining that he would structure the entire course around systematic examination of a single 6-minute exchange that multiple law professors across the country had independently identified as potentially the most pedagogically valuable clip of legal argumentation available for teaching purposes. Jasmine Crockett's comprehensive dismantling of Alan Dershowitz's constitutional framework during their Harvard Law School confrontation, when she had systematically proven through real-time source verification that his supposedly rigorous originalist analysis of congressional authority was built on misquotation of founders, mischaracterization of Supreme Court precedent, and selective citation that produced conclusions directly contradicted by complete texts of materials he cited in fragments. Professor Lederman had explained to his Georgetown students that this particular exchange had become standard viewing in first-year legal research and writing courses across the country for teaching source verification, in upper-level constitutional law seminars for demonstrating how to identify and expose mischaracterization of precedent, in trial advocacy courses for showing how to systematically dismantle opponents' factual premises through prepared evidence, and in judicial clerkship preparation programs for exemplifying the kind of rigorous source analysis that judges expected from their clerks and that separated elite legal practice from mediocre performance. What made the clip so universally valuable for legal education, Lederman had explained, was that Crockett's 6-minute systematic exposure of Dershowitz's decades of influential but source misrepresenting scholarship demonstrated in compressed format virtually every essential skill that effective legal practice required: comprehensive source verification that went beyond accepting characterizations from authoritative figures, strategic preparation that anticipated likely arguments and had evidence ready to disprove them, calm precision in presentation that allowed substance rather than rhetoric to carry impact, systematic organization that methodically addressed each claim rather than cherry-picking convenient targets, real-time adaptation that responded to Dershowitz's attempts at defense while maintaining coherent framework, and perhaps most importantly, the intellectual courage to challenge celebrated scholars' supposedly authoritative work by proving through verifiable evidence that decades of influence had been built on foundations that basic fact-checking revealed were false. The Georgetown seminar would spend the entire semester systematically examining every element of those 6 minutes to extract teachable principles that students could apply across their legal careers, making Crockett's exchange with Dershowitz what Professor Lederman characterized as potentially the single most pedagogically dense moment of legal argumentation available for teaching purposes precisely because it demonstrated so comprehensively how rigorous methodology could expose even the most credentialed scholarship when that scholarship violated basic standards of accurate source representation. If you want to see what happens when a single exchange becomes universal standard for teaching legal advocacy skills, because it demonstrates in 6 minutes principles that effective practice requires, and that law professors conclude every student must master, subscribe to this channel immediately, because we are going to examine every element of why this is the clip every law professor is showing their class, and what makes Crockett's systematic schooling of Dershowitz the definitive example of how rigorous legal analysis should function. Professor Lederman had begun the Georgetown seminar by showing students the complete 6-minute clip of Crockett systematically dismantling Dershowitz's constitutional framework at Harvard. He had then explained why this particular exchange had become standard viewing across legal education. Lederman had said, "I'm going to make a strong claim that I can defend. This 6-minute exchange is the single most valuable clip for teaching legal advocacy and analysis skills that I've encountered in 30 years of legal practice and teaching." And I'm not alone in that assessment. This has become standard viewing in law school courses across the country, from first-year legal research to advanced constitutional law seminars to trial advocacy programs. He had displayed documentation. "I've surveyed legal writing professors at the top 50 law schools. Approximately 80% are now showing this clip in their first-year courses. Constitutional law professors at over 100 schools have incorporated it into their teaching. Trial advocacy and appellate advocacy professors use it to demonstrate preparation and evidence deployment. It's become universal in legal education in ways that no other single advocacy moment has achieved." A student had asked, "Professor, what makes this particular clip so universally valuable? There are lots of examples of effective legal argument." Lederman had responded, "That's the right question, and answering it is what this seminar will spend the semester doing systematically. But let me give you the overview of why law professors have concluded this clip is uniquely valuable pedagogically." He had outlined the key elements. First, this demonstrates comprehensive source verification. Crockett didn't accept Dershowitz's characterizations of what founders said or what precedent held. She read the actual sources. That's the most fundamental legal research skill, and she demonstrates it perfectly by proving that sources don't say what Dershowitz claimed. Second, this demonstrates strategic preparation. Crockett anticipated Dershowitz would make certain arguments because she'd studied his work. She had evidence ready to disprove those arguments. That preparation is what separates effective advocates from those who hope to respond extemporaneously. Third, this demonstrates systematic organization. Watch how Crockett structures her response. She addresses each of Dershowitz's claims methodically, proving each is false before moving to the next. That organization makes her argument impossible to evade because every escape route has been closed systematically. Fourth, this demonstrates precision in characterization. Crockett doesn't make general attacks on Dershowitz's methodology. She identifies specific misquotations, specific precedent mischaracterizations, specific sources cited for propositions they contradict. That precision is what makes her exposure verifiable, rather than just being her word against his. Fifth, this demonstrates appropriate tone. Despite comprehensively destroying Dershowitz's life's work, Crockett maintains calm professional demeanor. She's not seeking rhetorical victory. She's proving factual accuracy. That tone makes substance rather than personality carry the argument. Professor Lederman had then explained how the seminar would proceed. "We're going to spend the semester breaking down every element of those 6 minutes. We'll examine how Crockett verified sources, how she prepared evidence, how she organized systematic response, how she maintained precision, how she adapted to Dershowitz's defensive attempts. And we'll extract principles you can apply in your own practice." The seminar's first several weeks had focused on source verification methodology. Professor Lederman had students read Dershowitz's actual scholarship on congressional oversight, then read the founding-era sources and Supreme Court precedent he cited, then compare Dershowitz's characterizations to what sources actually said. Lederman had explained the pedagogical value. This exercise, reading what scholars claim sources say, then reading what sources actually say, then identifying discrepancies, is the most important legal research skill you can develop. Crockett's clip demonstrates the results of doing this rigorously, but you need to practice the methodology yourselves. Students had worked through multiple examples, identifying where Dershowitz had misquoted Madison, where he had characterized Kilburn as establishing broad limits when it actually affirmed broad authority with narrow exception, where he had cited the St. Clair investigation as showing founding-era restraint when it actually demonstrated aggressive oversight. One student had observed, "Professor, what's striking is that these aren't subtle interpretive differences. These are cases where sources clearly say the opposite of what Dershowitz claimed. How did this persist for decades without anyone catching it?" Lederman had responded, "That's exactly the right question, and it's why this clip is so valuable." Crockett exposed that legal profession's quality control mechanisms failed. Peer review didn't catch these problems, editorial processes didn't catch them, courts citing his work didn't verify. Everyone deferred to credentials rather than verifying sources. That's the lesson law professors want every student to internalize. You cannot defer to authority. You must verify sources independently. Crockett demonstrates what happens when you do that rigorously. You discover that even celebrated scholars can produce work with systematic source problems that only verification exposes. The seminar's middle weeks had focused on strategic preparation and evidence deployment. Students had studied how Crockett had prepared for confronting Dershowitz by compiling specific examples of source misrepresentation that she could present with precision. Professor Lederman had students practice similar preparation. "I'm going to give you a scholarly article making constitutional arguments. Your assignment is to verify every source cited, identify any mischaracterizations, and prepare a presentation proving which characterizations are inaccurate," exactly what Crockett did with Dershowitz's work. Students had worked through this exercise multiple times, learning how to systematically verify sources, how to organize evidence of mischaracterization, and how to present findings with the kind of precision that made rebuttals impossible. Lederman had emphasized, "What you're learning is that effective advocacy requires this kind of comprehensive preparation." Crockett didn't improvise her response to Dershowitz. She had spent months verifying his sources and preparing evidence. That preparation is what allowed her to systematically dismantle his arguments in 6 minutes. Without that preparation, she couldn't have achieved that impact. The seminar's later weeks had focused on presentation skills, how to maintain systematic organization under pressure, how to adapt to opponents' defensive responses, and how to deliver comprehensive exposure with appropriate professional tone. Students had practiced presenting their source verification findings, with Lederman and classmates playing roles of scholars whose work was being challenged and attempting to deflect or defend. The exercise taught students how to maintain systematic approach while adapting to real-time responses. Lederman had explained, "Watch how Crockett responds when Dershowitz tries to defend by claiming different interpretations. She doesn't get sidetracked into interpretive debates. She returns to proving that his characterizations don't match what sources say. That discipline in maintaining focus on verifiable factual accuracy is crucial." By the seminar's conclusion, Georgetown students had internalized the principles that Crockett's 6-minute exchange demonstrated. They had practiced comprehensive source verification, strategic preparation of evidence, systematic organization of arguments, precision in characterization, and appropriate professional tone. But the Georgetown seminar was just one example of how law professors across the country were using Crockett's clip as standard teaching tool. Professor Lederman had compiled examples from other schools demonstrating the clip's universal pedagogical value. At Yale Law School, Professor Akela Marr used the clip in his constitutional law course to teach students how to identify when scholarship mischaracterizes precedent, with students assigned to read Dershowitz's articles alongside the actual Supreme Court decisions he cited to practice catching mischaracterizations. At Harvard Law School, the first-year legal research and writing program made the clip required viewing, with Professor Martha Mino explaining, "We need students to understand that source verification is not optional." Crockett demonstrates why. Even scholars at elite institutions can produce work with systematic source problems that only verification exposes. At Stanford Law School, Professor Pamela Karlan used the clip in her Supreme Court litigation seminar to teach advocacy skills, explaining, "Crockett's systematic dismantling of Dershowitz demonstrates preparation, organization, precision, and tone that Supreme Court advocates need to master." At University of Chicago Law School, Professor David Strauss used the clip to teach interpretive methodology, explaining, "Crockett demonstrates the difference between legitimate interpretive disagreement and factual mischaracterization of what sources say. That distinction is fundamental to honest scholarship." At Columbia Law School, Professor Jamal Green used the clip to teach professional ethics, explaining, "When Crockett proves that Dershowitz misquoted founders and mischaracterized precedent, she's exposing violations of professional responsibility to represent sources accurately. Legal ethics requires truthfulness, and Crockett demonstrates what happens when that requirement isn't met." Professor Lederman had compiled survey data showing the clip's penetration across legal education. Over 150 law schools were using it in at least one course, with many incorporating it into multiple courses. The clip had been viewed over 10 million times on educational platforms. Legal education conferences had featured multiple panels examining its pedagogical value. Most significantly, bar preparation courses had begun incorporating the clip to teach skills that bar examiners were emphasizing: source verification, systematic organization, precision in analysis. The clip had transcended law school to become standard in professional training across the legal profession. Professor Lederman had concluded the Georgetown seminar by having students reflect on why this particular clip had achieved such universal educational adoption. One student had observed, "What makes this clip so powerful for teaching is that it's real. This isn't a hypothetical or a simulation." Crockett actually exposed systematic problems in influential scholarship through rigorous verification. That makes the skills she demonstrates feel essential rather than academic. Another student had added, "And what makes it valuable is that it's comprehensive. Those 6 minutes demonstrate virtually every important advocacy skill. We can study one clip and learn principles that apply across different practice contexts." Lederman had agreed. That comprehensiveness is exactly why this has become the clip every law professor shows. It's not just good at teaching one skill. It demonstrates source verification, strategic preparation, systematic organization, analytical precision, professional tone, real-time adaptation, intellectual courage. That density of pedagogically valuable content in 6 minutes is unprecedented. He had delivered his final assessment. "I believe legal education will reference this clip for generations. Future lawyers will study Crockett's systematic schooling of Dershowitz the way previous generations studied famous Supreme Court arguments or legendary trial performances." This has become canonical for legal education because it demonstrates with unusual clarity the skills that effective legal practice requires. The Georgetown seminar had concluded, but its examination of why the Crockett-Dershowitz exchange had become universal standard for legal education reflected broader recognition across the profession that this particular moment exemplified principles every legal professional needed to master. Legal education conferences subsequently featured panels examining the clip's pedagogical impact, with law professors sharing how they incorporated it into courses and what principles students extracted from studying it. The Association of American Law Schools published a teaching guide examining the clip's educational value, providing suggestions for how professors across different courses could use it to teach various skills from source verification to professional ethics. Bar examiners began incorporating questions testing skills the clip demonstrated, asking examinees to identify when cited sources were mischaracterized, to organize systematic responses to complex arguments, to maintain appropriate professional tone in adversarial contexts. For Crockett, having her 6-minute exchange with Dershowitz become universal standard, in legal education represented recognition that she had demonstrated principles transcending immediate political context and exemplifying what rigorous legal practice required. In subsequent interviews, Crockett expressed appreciation that legal educators were using her methodology as teaching tool. She emphasized that source verification wasn't just for confronting celebrated scholars, it was fundamental skill every lawyer needed for evaluating any argument's factual foundations. So, if this examination of why a single 6-minute exchange became the clip every law professor shows their class, because it demonstrates with unusual comprehensiveness the skills effective legal practice requires, has shown you why rigorous source verification, combined with strategic preparation and systematic presentation, can expose even influential scholarship when it violates basic standards of accuracy, and why legal education has recognized this moment as exemplifying principles every student must master. Subscribe to this channel for continued analysis of how exceptional advocacy becomes teaching standard and why legal profession has concluded. Crockett's systematic schooling of Dershowitz represents definitive example of how rigorous legal analysis should function. The Georgetown Law Seminar and the broader legal education adoption of Crockett's clip as universal teaching standard was more than pedagogical trend. It was legal profession's recognition that 6 minutes of comprehensive source-based exposure had demonstrated with unusual clarity the skills that separated rigorous legal practice from mediocre performance, that studying how Crockett systematically dismantled Dershowitz's decades of influential but source misrepresenting scholarship taught principles applicable across all legal contexts from first-year research to Supreme Court advocacy, and that this moment had achieved canonical status in legal education because it exemplified with remarkable density what effective legal argumentation requires when grounded in verifiable accuracy rather than in credentials or rhetorical skill alone.